The first thing she said to my staff was not a request. It was an expectation that reality would bend around her voice. I was standing inside the operations office of Silverline Harbor Marina when I heard the commotion near the fuel dock, the kind of disturbance that travels faster than footsteps. My name is Captain Ryan Mitchell, and I built this marina from a neglected stretch of coastline into a fully operating $3 million marine facility serving private vessels, commercial boats, and seasonal contractors who depend on regulated fuel access. That morning started like any other, quiet winds moving across the docks, ropes creaking softly against pilings, and the low hum of diesel pumps preparing for the first scheduled refueling cycle. Then she arrived. Linda Carter, president of the Harborview Community Association, walked directly onto the fuel dock without checking in, without acknowledgement of procedure, and without hesitation. I saw her before I heard her, standing near Pump 3 with a posture that suggested she believed she had already been granted authority she had never earned. She pointed at the fuel operator and said she wanted marine diesel, full tank, no charge, and she said it loudly enough for nearby boat crews to stop what they were doing. There was no confusion in her tone, only entitlement, as if the concept of payment did not apply to her interpretation of community boundaries. One of my staff members calmly explained that all fuel is metered, documented, and billed according to marina policy, and that no exceptions exist for private association requests. That was when her expression changed, not into surprise, but into irritation, as if rules were an inconvenience she had not anticipated. She replied that the marina operated inside the Harborview jurisdiction and that HOA regulations allowed community officers to authorize complimentary services for shared waterfront amenities. I was already walking toward the dock before she finished speaking. The sound of my boots on the wooden planks was steady, measured, not rushed, because rushing implies uncertainty, and I had none. When I reached the edge of the fueling station, I stopped at a distance where I could see both her and my staff clearly, making sure my presence did not interrupt the operational flow of the marina. She turned toward me immediately, as if she had been waiting for the person she assumed would eventually comply. I introduced myself without raising my voice, confirming that I was the marina owner and responsible authority for all fuel distribution on site. She responded by repeating her demand, this time framing it as an official instruction rather than a request, insisting that the marina was obligated to provide free diesel under community benefit clauses she claimed existed in association policy. I asked her to provide the specific documentation that granted her access to operational fuel inventory. She did not answer the question. Instead, she said she would contact law enforcement to resolve what she called noncompliance with community regulations. Her confidence suggested she believed external authority would automatically validate her claim. Around us, boat operators slowed their activity, watching the exchange without intervening, the sound of water against hulls becoming more noticeable as silence spread across the dock. I could feel the shift happening, not in emotion, but in structure, as if the situation was moving from informal dispute into formal review. And in that moment, as she pulled out her phone and began dialing, I realized she had just initiated a process she did not fully understand, one that would soon bring an authority far beyond the scope of any community association policy she had ever relied on. I did not move immediately after she made the call. Instead, I stayed at the edge of the fuel dock, watching the rhythm of the marina continue around the disruption as if the water itself refused to acknowledge the argument unfolding above it. Boats still needed fuel, lines still needed adjusting, and my staff continued their work with controlled focus, but I could feel the attention of everyone nearby shifting toward the center of the confrontation. Linda Carter stood near Pump 3, holding her phone like a declaration rather than a communication device, her posture unchanged, her confidence still intact. She believed the next arrival would validate her position, that external enforcement would automatically interpret the situation through her version of community authority. My name is Captain Ryan Mitchell, and I have learned that confidence built on assumption always feels strongest right before it meets verification. The marina around us remained operational, but quieter now, as if even the sound of diesel pumps had lowered itself to observe what would happen next. A few minutes passed before the patrol vehicle arrived at the entrance gate, moving slowly along the access road that leads down to the docks. It stopped at a safe distance, and two officers stepped out with the kind of calm professionalism that does not belong to urgency, but to procedure. Linda immediately turned toward them, her expression shifting into relief, as if the situation had finally reached the audience she was waiting for. She began walking toward them before they even reached the dock, speaking quickly, explaining that the marina owner was refusing compliance with what she called community entitlement regulations for essential marine services. I remained where I was, observing without interruption, allowing the exchange to unfold without influence. One of the officers nodded slightly, listening without reaction, while the other looked past her toward the fuel dock operations area, scanning the environment rather than focusing on her interpretation. I noticed that detail immediately. Professionals in that position do not evaluate through the person speaking first. They evaluate through the structure around the claim. When Linda finished speaking, she gestured back toward me, expecting alignment to follow. The officers walked toward the dock together, and I stepped forward to meet them halfway, maintaining a calm and neutral posture. I identified myself clearly as the marina owner and operator, and I confirmed that all fuel distribution processes are governed by federal maritime compliance standards and private operational policy, with no standing agreements granting free service to private association representatives. I saw the officer's expression remain unchanged, but his attention shifted slightly toward me in a way that indicated recognition of context beyond the immediate complaint. Linda interrupted again, insisting that HOA authority extended over waterfront amenities and that refusal to comply constituted operational misconduct. The second officer raised a hand gently, not in dismissal, but in procedural control, asking for clarification on jurisdictional boundaries and documentation of any legal authority supporting her claim. She hesitated for the first time since arriving, then repeated her assertion without producing any written support. I could feel the atmosphere change at that moment, not emotionally, but structurally, as the exchange moved away from confrontation and into verification. The sound of water against the dock became more noticeable again as voices lowered and attention narrowed. One of my staff members stood quietly near the fueling station, holding a clipboard with log transactions, prepared to present operational records if requested. I did not intervene because intervention was no longer necessary. The process had already shifted into a framework where statements alone no longer carried weight without documentation. Linda looked at me again, this time with a slight tension in her expression, as if she was realizing that the arrival of law enforcement did not automatically confirm her interpretation of authority. And in that moment, standing on the dock between operational order and external review, I understood that the situation had crossed into a stage where assumption would no longer guide the outcome. Only verified jurisdiction would. I remained on the dock without changing my position as the interaction with law enforcement continued to develop in front of me with increasing procedural clarity rather than emotional escalation. The officers had moved from initial listening into structured questioning, focusing less on the tone of the complaint and more on the boundaries of authority that defined the situation. Linda Carter stood slightly ahead of me now, closer to the officers, speaking with increasing urgency as she repeated her claim that the marina was obligated under Harborview community regulations to provide complimentary marine diesel for association representatives. Her confidence was still visible, but it was no longer stable in the same way it had been earlier. It now carried a subtle dependency on validation from the officers standing in front of her. I observed carefully as one of the officers requested documentation supporting her assertion. There was no confrontation in the request, only standard procedure. That distinction mattered. Linda paused for the first time since arriving, then began searching through her phone as if digital references could substitute for formal jurisdictional authority. My name is Captain Ryan Mitchell, and I understood in that moment that systems of enforcement do not operate on confidence or expectation, but on recorded permission and verifiable scope. Around us, the marina continued its operations in the background, but even routine movement seemed quieter, as if every worker and boat operator had unconsciously shifted into observation mode. The officer who had initially spoken with her turned slightly toward me and asked for confirmation of my role as marina owner and operator. I provided identification without hesitation and confirmed that all fuel transactions are governed by documented pricing structures, compliance protocols, and operational jurisdiction under maritime commercial standards. He nodded once, acknowledging receipt of that information without reaction. The second officer then asked if there were any written agreements or standing authorizations that granted the Harborview Community Association access to complimentary fuel services. I answered clearly that no such agreements exist and that all services are billed equally under published marina policy. At that point, I noticed Linda's posture shift slightly. It was not dramatic, but it reflected the first visible sign that her assumption of automatic authority was no longer holding its internal structure. She attempted to reframe her position again, stating that prior informal practices within the community had allowed similar arrangements. But the officer interrupted gently, requesting that only documented and current agreements be considered for jurisdictional review. That interruption was not aggressive, but it redefined the direction of the conversation. The focus had fully transitioned from assertion to verification. I could see one of my staff members standing near the fuel control terminal, ready to provide transaction logs if requested, but no one had asked yet because the officers were still establishing the foundation of authority before moving into operational details. Linda turned toward me again, her expression now carrying frustration mixed with uncertainty, as if she was realizing that the presence of law enforcement did not automatically reinforce her interpretation of community power. The marina around us remained steady, the sound of water against pilings and the distant movement of vessels continuing without interruption, reinforcing the contrast between operational normalcy and procedural evaluation. One of the officers finally stepped slightly closer to me and asked if I was willing to provide access to relevant records for verification purposes. I confirmed immediately and instructed my staff to prepare full fuel transaction logs and compliance documentation. That moment marked a clear structural shift in the interaction. Linda no longer spoke. She simply watched as the process moved away from verbal dispute and into documented review. And in that quiet transition on the dock, I understood that the situation was no longer about who spoke with confidence, but about whose authority could be validated through records that existed beyond the moment of conflict. I remained on the dock while the procedural review moved into its next phase, watching as the interaction between the officers, my staff, and Linda Carter shifted from verbal exchange into structured documentation. The marina no longer felt like it was holding a dispute. It felt like it was hosting an audit. My name is Captain Ryan Mitchell, and I had seen enough regulatory inspections in my career to recognize when a situation stops being about what someone believes and becomes about what can be proven on record. One of my staff members approached the fuel control station and began printing transaction logs, each sheet detailing timestamps, vessel identification numbers, fuel quantities, and billing confirmations. The sound of the printer was small but noticeable in the quiet tension that had settled over the dock. The officers reviewed the first set of documents without interruption, scanning through entries with the calm focus of professionals verifying jurisdictional consistency rather than reacting to the earlier claim made by Linda Carter. She stood slightly behind them now, no longer leading the interaction, her posture still upright but less certain, as if the structure she had been relying on was no longer supporting her position in the same way. I observed as one officer asked my staff to confirm whether any vessel associated with Harborview Community Association had ever been granted complimentary fuel under formal authorization. The response was immediate and clear. There had been no such authorization, no standing agreement, and no operational exception recorded in the system. The officer acknowledged this without comment, continuing to review the printed logs in sequence. Linda attempted to speak again, stating that previous informal arrangements had been understood within the community as standard practice, but the officer raised a hand slightly and redirected the focus back to documented policy and recorded transactions. That moment marked another subtle but important shift. The conversation was no longer responsive to interpretation. It was anchored entirely in verifiable records. I could see Linda's frustration beginning to surface not as confrontation, but as disbelief that her internal framework was no longer being treated as valid reference material. Around us, the marina remained active, but even that activity seemed to operate in a reduced volume, as if everyone present understood that the primary event was now occurring through paperwork rather than speech. My staff continued to provide additional records, including maintenance logs for fuel pumps, compliance inspection reports, and pricing schedules approved under commercial maritime regulation standards. Each document added another layer of structure to the review, reinforcing that operations at the marina were governed by established regulatory frameworks rather than community interpretation. One of the officers compared entries across multiple sheets, then confirmed with a quiet nod that all fuel transactions were consistent with documented policy. He then asked if there were any recorded incidents of unauthorized fuel requests or enforcement attempts by external associations. I responded that there had been prior verbal claims, but no documented authority supporting them, and that any operational decisions had always been deferred to formal jurisdictional standards. Linda finally stepped forward again, attempting to emphasize her position as HOA leadership, but her words were no longer met with engagement in the same way. The officers listened without interruption, then returned their focus to the records in front of them, effectively separating claim from relevance. I could feel the shift complete itself at that point. What had begun as an accusation had transformed into a procedural review, and what had once been presented as authority had now been reduced to an unverified assertion within a documented system. The marina's operational environment continued uninterrupted, but the meaning of the moment had changed entirely. And as I stood there watching the final pages of fuel logs being reviewed, I understood that the outcome was no longer dependent on who spoke first or who demanded louder, but on which version of reality was supported by records that could not be overridden by assumption. I remained on the dock as the final stage of the review unfolded, watching the printed fuel logs being organized into a structured sequence that now defined the entire direction of the investigation. The marina had returned to its normal rhythm on the surface, but beneath that normality, there was a clear procedural weight that had taken over every interaction. My name is Captain Ryan Mitchell, and I could recognize the moment when a situation transitions from active dispute into formal determination, because at that point, conversation becomes irrelevant and documentation becomes the only language that matters. The officers had moved the collected records into a consolidated stack, comparing transaction histories with operational policy documents provided by my staff. Each page reinforced the same conclusion, that every fuel sale had been processed under standard commercial protocol with no deviation, no exemption, and no recorded authorization for external community entitlement. Linda Carter stood slightly apart from the center of attention now, no longer directing the flow of conversation, but still attempting to maintain presence in the situation. Her posture remained upright, but her gestures had slowed, as if she was realizing that repetition of her claim no longer influenced the direction of the review. One of the officers spoke briefly to confirm the absence of any legal agreement between the marina and the Harborview Community Association regarding complimentary fuel services. The confirmation was straightforward, recorded, and final in tone. There was no debate in the response, only acknowledgement of what the documentation already demonstrated. I observed carefully as the second officer reviewed a final set of compliance records, including regulatory filings, safety certifications, and pricing schedules submitted to maritime oversight authorities. The consistency across all documents reinforced the operational integrity of the marina, and each verification step reduced the remaining ambiguity in the situation. Linda attempted once more to assert that prior community expectations had always included informal access arrangements, but her statement was not challenged or engaged with in the same way as before. Instead, it was acknowledged and then set aside, as the focus remained strictly on recorded authority. I could see the shift in her expression now, not sudden, but gradual, as if the realization was forming that procedural systems do not operate on memory or assumption, but only on documented authorization. Around us, the marina continued its controlled activity, with staff maintaining normal operations while remaining attentive to the ongoing review. The sound of water against the dock pilings, the distant movement of boats preparing to depart, and the steady mechanical rhythm of fuel equipment all continued without interruption, reinforcing the contrast between operational stability and administrative evaluation. One of the officers finally closed the last folder and placed it on top of the stack, signaling the completion of the document review phase. He spoke calmly, stating that based on the records provided, all fuel transactions were compliant with established maritime operational standards, and that no evidence supported the claim of mandatory complimentary service under any recognized jurisdiction. The statement was not directed at any individual. It was a procedural conclusion based entirely on documentation. Linda Carter responded with a final attempt to reframe her position, referencing community governance authority, but her words no longer shifted the structure of the conversation. The officers acknowledged her statement briefly, then returned their attention to the established records and operational policies that define the marina's authority boundaries. I remained still as the conclusion of the review became clear in its direction, understanding that the process had now fully transitioned into formal resolution. The marina had not changed in its physical form, but its legal clarity had been reinforced through verification, and the boundaries of authority had been explicitly reaffirmed through documented jurisdiction. And in that moment, standing on the dock as the final pages were filed away, I understood that control in situations like this is never determined by assertion, but by the systems that confirm what is valid and what has no standing within recorded law. I remained on the dock even after the final documentation was placed into the official review stack, because the conclusion of a procedural process is often more important than the moment it is announced. The marina around me had returned to full operational rhythm, yet the meaning of what had just occurred continued to settle into every layer of activity. My name is Captain Ryan Mitchell, and I understood that when a jurisdictional review reaches its final stage, what remains is not uncertainty, but alignment between recorded authority and physical reality. The officers stood near the central fuel station reviewing their final notes, speaking in low, controlled tones that indicated the case had moved out of active dispute and into formal closure. Linda Carter remained present near the edge of the dock, no longer addressing the officers directly, but still holding onto a posture that suggested resistance had not yet fully transitioned into acceptance. However, there was no longer any procedural space left for interpretation. One of the officers closed his folder and confirmed that all submitted documentation had been reviewed, verified, and matched against maritime operational regulations. The confirmation was simple, without emphasis, because in professional review processes, finality is not expressed emotionally. It is recorded structurally. I observed as the second officer spoke briefly into his radio, relaying confirmation that the marina's fuel operations were compliant and that no enforceable claim existed supporting the Harborview Community Association's demand for complimentary services. The message was short, precise, and final in nature. Around us, the marina continued its steady movement, but I could feel the change in how Linda was now positioned within the environment. She was no longer the center of attention, nor the driver of the situation. Instead, she was part of the record being concluded. I saw her glance toward the officers again, as if expecting additional consideration or reinterpretation, but the structure of the process had already moved beyond that stage. One of the officers approached me directly and confirmed that the matter was closed from a jurisdictional standpoint, and that all further concerns would need to follow formal administrative channels rather than on-site enforcement. I acknowledged the statement without hesitation, understanding that closure in these contexts is not symbolic, but procedural. It means no further action will be taken because no violation has been established within enforceable boundaries. Linda finally spoke again, but her voice carried a different tone now, less assertive and more uncertain, as she attempted to restate the idea that community authority had been misunderstood. The officer responded calmly, explaining that community guidelines cannot override commercial maritime regulation or documented operational policy. There was no confrontation in the explanation, only clarification of hierarchy within jurisdictional systems. I remained still as this final exchange took place, observing how quickly confidence can dissolve when it is no longer supported by enforceable structure. My staff continued normal marina operations behind me, refueling vessels and managing dock assignments as if nothing unusual had occurred, and in a way, nothing had changed operationally. What had changed was entirely structural, existing in documentation rather than environment. The officers began to prepare to leave, gathering their materials and confirming final notes before departing the dock. Linda stood quietly now, no longer speaking, watching the process conclude without further participation. I understood then that the outcome had already been determined several steps earlier, not by confrontation or persuasion, but by verification against established authority frameworks. As the patrol vehicle slowly exited the marina entrance, the sound of its tires fading into the distance, I turned my attention back to the dock itself. The fuel station continued operating under standard procedure. Boats continued arriving and departing, and the water moved with the same steady rhythm it always had. Yet beneath that continuity, the structure of authority had been reaffirmed in a way that no verbal claim could override. And in that final moment, I recognized the simple reality that governs every situation like this. When jurisdiction is confirmed through documentation, all competing assertions cease to have operational weight. I remained at the marina long after the patrol vehicle disappeared down the coastal access road, because the end of an enforcement review is never truly defined by the departure of those who conduct it. It is defined by the shift in how the environment itself responds afterward. My name is Captain Ryan Mitchell, and I have learned that in regulated operations like this, the most important moment is not when authority arrives, but when every system around it confirms that nothing remains unresolved. The docks continued their steady rhythm, boats adjusting position against the tide, fuel hoses being coiled, transaction receipts printing in the background, all returning to normal operational behavior as if the earlier disruption had been absorbed into the structure of routine. Yet I could still feel the residual effect of what had taken place, not as tension, but as clarity. Linda Carter stood near the edge of the fuel dock for several moments after the officers left, no longer speaking, no longer attempting to reassert her earlier position. Her posture had changed in a way that was subtle but unmistakable. It was no longer the posture of someone directing a situation, but of someone recalculating their understanding of it. Eventually, she turned slightly as if to speak, then stopped, reconsidered, and remained silent. I did not approach her. There was no need for further exchange because nothing she could say would alter what had already been recorded, verified, and concluded within jurisdictional authority. Instead, I walked slowly along the dock, observing my staff return fully to operational workflow, checking fuel logs, resetting pump indicators, and resuming standard vessel service procedures without interruption. My name is Captain Ryan Mitchell, and I understood at that moment that resolution in systems like this does not arrive as a single event, but as a sequence of confirmations that gradually remove all remaining ambiguity. A few minutes later, one of my senior staff members approached me and confirmed that the official notice from law enforcement had been received and logged into the Marina compliance system. It stated clearly that no enforcement action would be taken and that all fuel operations remained within regulatory standards under maritime commercial guidelines. The language was formal, procedural, and absolute in its lack of interpretation. I acknowledged the update without response beyond a simple nod, because at that stage, acknowledgement was the only action required. The marina had already resumed full operational flow, and the presence of external review had transitioned into documented closure. I looked back toward the fuel dock where Linda had been standing earlier. She was now walking slowly toward the parking area, no longer engaged with staff or officers, moving in a direction that suggested departure rather than continuation. There was no confrontation, no final exchange, only the natural conclusion of a process that had already been completed at the structural level. I remained on the dock as the sun began to lower toward the horizon, casting long reflections across the water between the pilings. The sound of engines, ropes, and water movement returned to its normal pattern, and the marina resumed its identity as an operational facility rather than a site of dispute. I reviewed the earlier sequence in my mind not as conflict, but as procedure, an assertion made without jurisdiction, a claim escalated through external enforcement, a verification process conducted through documentation, and a final determination based entirely on recorded authority. Nothing about the outcome required interpretation because everything had been resolved through systems that operate independently of individual belief. And as I stood there watching the marina return fully to its natural rhythm, I understood the final principle that governs every situation like this. When authority is defined by verified jurisdiction rather than assumption, there is no victory or defeat, only confirmation of what was already true within the system from the beginning. I remained at the marina after the final operational reports had been logged, not because anything remained unresolved, but because I wanted to observe how a system returns to equilibrium after external verification has fully concluded. My name is Captain Ryan Mitchell, and I have always believed that the most revealing moment in any regulated environment is not the conflict itself, but the return to standard function once all authority checks have been completed. The docks were already active again, with vessels departing in scheduled intervals, fuel systems cycling normally, and staff moving through their tasks with steady discipline. There was no disruption left in the operational flow, only the faint memory of procedural inspection embedded in documentation that now sat archived within our compliance records. I stood near the central dock for several minutes, watching the water reflect the late afternoon light as if nothing had occurred beyond routine administrative confirmation. Linda Carter had already left the immediate fuel station area earlier, moving toward the marina exit without further engagement, her presence no longer influencing the operational environment in any measurable way. I did not follow or observe her departure closely because there was no remaining procedural requirement to do so. Instead, I focused on the final internal updates being processed by my staff, who were completing end-of-cycle reports confirming that all fuel transactions reviewed during the inspection matched established maritime compliance standards without deviation. One of my senior operators approached me and confirmed that the formal notice from law enforcement had been fully entered into the Marina system, marking the closure of the jurisdictional review. The wording of the document was precise, stating that no violations were found and that all operations remained compliant under applicable maritime commercial regulations. I acknowledged the update without commentary because at that stage, there was nothing left to interpret or dispute. My name is Captain Ryan Mitchell, and I recognize that closure in systems like this does not feel like resolution in the emotional sense. It feels like stabilization after all variables have been accounted for. I walked slowly along the dock, observing each station return to standard operating rhythm, from fuel control panels to vessel scheduling boards, all functioning exactly as they had before the disruption. The difference now was not in activity, but in certainty. Every operational element had been reviewed and confirmed, and nothing remained dependent on assumption or external claim. I paused near the fuel control terminal where the initial confrontation had begun earlier that day, and I noticed how quickly the space had returned to ordinary use. Boats were once again lining up for service, crew members communicating through routine signals, and the sound of engines blending into the natural background of the marina environment. There was no indication that any external authority had been present beyond the documentation stored in our record system. I reflected briefly on the sequence of events, not as conflict, but as procedural progression, an assertion made without jurisdiction, a formal complaint escalated through external enforcement, a documented review conducted through official channels, and a final determination based entirely on verified regulatory authority. Each step followed the structure required by maritime governance systems, leaving no ambiguity in the final outcome. As the sun lowered further over the water, casting long reflections across the dock pilings, I remained still for a moment, observing how completely the marina had returned to its baseline state. There was no sense of victory or defeat, only the confirmation that all claims had been measured against enforceable standards and resolved accordingly. And in that final moment of quiet operational stability, I understood the core principle that defines every situation governed by structured authority. When jurisdiction is clearly established and properly documented, outcomes are not decided by force of claim, but by alignment with systems that exist beyond individual interpretation, leaving only verified reality as the final state of record. I remained at the marina after the final confirmation had been entered into the operational system, not because there was anything left unresolved, but because I wanted to observe the final stage of transition when a situation fully returns to its baseline state after formal jurisdictional closure. My name is Captain Ryan Mitchell, and I have learned that in structured environments like this, the most important indicator of resolution is not the absence of noise, but the return of normal operational rhythm without residual uncertainty. The docks were now fully active again, with vessels arriving and departing according to schedule, fuel systems operating under standard billing procedures, and staff executing their duties with consistent procedural discipline. There was no remaining disruption in physical operations, Only the documented record of what had occurred earlier now stored within compliance archives as a closed jurisdictional review. I stood near the central fuel station for several minutes, observing how quickly the environment had normalized once external enforcement had completed its verification process. Linda Carter had already left the Marina property earlier, her departure unaccompanied by further interaction or procedural requirement, marking the end of her physical presence within the operational space. I did not observe her final movements because there was no necessity to extend attention beyond the completion of the formal process. Instead, I focused on the internal confirmation cycle being completed by my staff, who were finalizing end-of-day reports, ensuring that all fuel transactions, safety protocols, and compliance logs reflected full alignment with maritime commercial regulations. One of my senior operators approached and confirmed that the official closure notice from law enforcement had been fully integrated into the Marina record system. The document stated clearly that no violations had been identified and that all operational procedures were compliant under applicable jurisdictional standards. I acknowledged the confirmation without additional comment, because at that stage there was nothing further to interpret, challenge, or resolve. My name is Captain Ryan Mitchell, and I understood that closure in systems governed by law and documentation does not produce emotional resolution. It produces structural stability where all variables have already been accounted for and verified. I walked slowly along the dock, observing the marina return to its natural rhythm, with crews managing vessels, fuel stations operating under routine demand, and communication between staff returning to standard operational language. The difference now was not in activity, but in certainty, because every element that had been questioned had already been reviewed and confirmed through documented authority. I paused briefly at the fuel dock where the initial confrontation had occurred earlier, noting how completely the space had returned to ordinary function. There was no remaining indication of dispute, only the continuity of operations governed by established procedures and verified compliance records. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, casting long reflections across the water and dock pilings, I remained still for a moment, observing the final transition from review state to full operational normalcy. There was no sense of victory or defeat, only confirmation that all claims had been evaluated against enforceable standards and resolved within the framework of jurisdictional authority. I reflected briefly on the full sequence of events, not as conflict, but as procedural structure. An assertion made without legal standing, a complaint escalated through external enforcement, a formal review conducted through documentation and inspection, and a final determination based entirely on verified regulatory compliance. Each stage had followed the exact structure required under maritime governance systems, leaving no ambiguity in the final outcome or its enforcement. And as I stood there watching the marina operate under restored clarity, I understood the final principle that governs every situation of this nature. When authority is defined through documented jurisdiction rather than personal assertion, resolution is never achieved through confrontation, but through verification that leaves only one reality recognized within the system. And that reality becomes the permanent record from which no further dispute can override what has already been formally confirmed.